Welcome to podcast Sarah and Michael.
You know, when you flip a light switch or pump gas into your car, there's just this underlying assumption of flow.
Right. Yeah, you just expect it to be there.
Exactly. It's like a biological circulatory system, you know?
Right.
The heart pumps, the blood moves, and the vast, complex machine of the modern world just kind of works.
It's completely seamless. I mean, we really rarely stop to consider the intricate mechanics of global supply chains until something fundamentally breaks. We're just wired to expect predictability.
And it remains entirely invisible to us until suddenly somebody places a massive tourniquet right on the main artery of the global economy.
And practically overnight, that invisible flow becomes literally the only thing anyone can focus on. The pressure starts building up, the numbers go red, and, well, the entire system begins to panic.
Which is exactly what we're looking at today. Welcome to a brand new deep dive. I'm Michael.
And I'm Sarah.
Today is Monday, May 11th, 2026. And we are stepping directly into the center of a global pressure cooker right now. So our mission for this deep dive is to unpack the really intense, frankly, alarming fallout from the total collapse of the U.S.-Iran peace talks.
Yeah, it's a massive shift.
It is. We're looking at an ongoing 10-week war that is now bleeding out directly into the Strait of Hormuz. And specifically, we want to focus on how this is sending absolute shockwaves through global oil markets and forcing the United States into an incredibly complex, really unprecedented geopolitical stance.
We're watching the foundational rules of international trade and military deterrence basically get rewritten in real time. And the economic pressure gauge is, it's practically breaking at this point.
And here's where it gets really interesting for you listening, because we aren't just talking about, dry supply and demand charts or political rhetoric here.
Right, the real world impact is wild.
Totally. We're looking at a global oil deficit so massive it's genuinely hard to wrap your head around. We've got commercial ships literally going dark and risking everything to sneak past military blockades.
Which is terrifying, honestly.
It is. And then there's this bizarre twist where Israel's prime minister is suddenly demanding the U.S. cut off billions of dollars in military aid to his own country.
The underlying through line here is leverage, right? It's about who has it, who's losing it, and what happens when those traditional mechanisms of power just completely snap.
Exactly. And because the consequences of this are landing right on your doorstep, we have to start with the actual catalyst for this current market panic.
Right. The breakdown of the ceasefire.
Yeah, the fragile ceasefire that was supposed to pause this ongoing conflict. A conflict that, just to remind everyone, kicked off with U.S. and Israeli airstrikes way back on February 28th.
And for a brief moment there, we actually had a legitimate window of hope for de-escalation.
Which feels like forever ago now.
It really does. But Iran actually sent a peace proposal, which was interestingly routed through Pakistan, acting as a diplomatic mediator.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, and Tehran's terms were incredibly blunt. They wanted three specific things. One, an immediate end to the war on all fronts. Two, the lifting of the U.S. naval blockade on Iranian ports. And three, an ironclad guarantee against any future attacks.
I mean, on the surface, that sounds like a fairly standard opening bid to freeze a conflict, doesn't it? Just stop shooting, let our ships move, and promise not to shoot again.
You'd think so, yeah. But you have to look at how that proposal was received in Washington and Jerusalem.
Not well, I'm guessing.
Not well at all. Those terms were treated as an absolute non-starter. President Trump took to Truth Social on Sunday and just flat out rejected the proposal.
He called it completely unacceptable.
Right, exactly. Completely unacceptable. And he laid down a very stark, very public threat. He stated that if a deal isn't reached, the bombing will begin again, and at a much higher intensity than before.
Wow. And we actually got to look under the hood at what the U.S. is demanding in return, right? Thanks to that reported one-page U.S. memo floating around.
Yeah, the one detailed by Axios.
Right, the Axios report. So it contains 14 specific conditions for a final deal. And this is a heavy, uncompromising list. It includes completely halting nuclear enrichment and, critically for the global economy, restoring free navigation in the Strait of Hormuz.
And then, you layer Israel's stance on top of that U.S. memo.
Which only complicates things further.
Or massively.
Right.
Prime Minister Netanyahu went on CBS's 60 Minutes and drew this really rigid line in the sand. He stated the war simply isn't over until Iran's enriched uranium is eliminated and the facilities themselves are entirely dismantled.
Meanwhile, you've got Iran's president, Masoud Pezeshkian, standing before his own people saying Iran won't bow to enemies or surrender just because they are sitting at a negotiating table.
Right, it's a total impasse.
I have to jump in here and look at the mechanics of this standoff because to me, it feels like a real estate negotiation where the buyer and the seller aren't even looking at the same house.
That's a really good way to put it.
Right, like the buyer is making an offer on a two-bedroom condo and the seller is handing over the keys to a boat. They're just operating in different realities. One side says, just lift the naval blockade, and the other side says, dismantle your entire nuclear infrastructure.
It's completely asymmetrical.
Exactly. So, looking at this objectively, were these demands ever actually meant to be accepted, or is this just, I don't know, political theater to justify the next phase of escalation?
That framing really hits at the core of international negotiation theory. What you're seeing here are textbook maximalist positions.
Meaning they ask for the moon knowing they won't get it.
Exactly. When a nation demands the complete, verifiable dismantling of an adversary's core strategic asset, in this case, Iran's nuclear program, the expected answer is always going to be no.
Right, there's no way they just agree to that.
And conversely, demanding the immediate withdrawal of a U.S. Navy blockade without offering major, verifiable concessions on their end is equally unrealistic.
So they're essentially setting each other up to fail on purpose.
They really are. They're establishing a baseline for domestic consumption. Basically, neither side feels enough internal political or economic pain yet to make actual concessions.
So the theater part is just to galvanize their bases.
Precisely. It sets the stage for leadership to turn around to their people and say, look, we tried diplomacy, we offered terms, they were entirely unreasonable, so now we are forced to use military action. It's all about securing the justification for the kinetic force that follows.
And because diplomacy has stalled out completely, that physical standoff at sea remains highly active, which is where the geopolitical chess match hits you, the listener, directly in the wallet.
Because the breakdown of talks has an immediate physical consequence on the water.
Exactly. And it centers entirely on the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, this is arguably the most critical maritime choke point on the planet for energy, right?
Without a doubt. We're talking about a super narrow passage that handles roughly 1/5 of the world's entire oil and gas supply.
And right now, it's basically a militarized zone defined by a tit-for-tat blockade. The U.S. is blockading Iranian ports, trying to apply maximum economic pressure to force compliance with those 14 conditions.
Right, and in retaliation, Iran is effectively restricting movement through the strait itself.
And the market numbers coming out of this standoff are just terrifying. I mean, Brent crude, which is the major global price benchmark, surged over $3. That's a 3.14% jump, hitting $104.47 a barrel.
Wow.
Yeah, and the U.S. benchmark, WTI, jumped 3.24% to $98.51, just off the failed talks.
We toss around percentages on the news a lot, but it is so vital to understand the sheer scale of a 3% jump in a single trading session.
Right. It doesn't sound like much until you see the ripple effect.
Exactly. Oil is the baseline cost for the modern world. When crude spikes that aggressively, it isn't just an abstract number for Wall Street traders. It immediately prices into transportation logistics, manufacturing, plastics, agriculture.
And eventually, literally the cost of goods on your local supermarket shelf.
Yes. You pay for it at the grocery store.
But the raw price is really only half the story here. Because Saudi Aramco released this staggering piece of information. They calculate that the world has already lost approximately 1 billion barrels of oil from the market in just the last 2 months of this conflict.
1 billion barrels.
Yeah.
Erased from the global ledger. That is just, it's almost unfathomable.
And Aramco was very clear about the mechanics of recovery here. They said even if a comprehensive peace treaty was signed tomorrow morning and shipping resumed at 100% capacity, the market will take a significant amount of time to recover.
And that's the scary part.
But why is that? I mean, if the ships start moving, doesn't the oil just flow back into the system?
Well, it's not a faucet you just turn back on, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Global supply chains operate on these tightly choreographed just-in-time schedules.
Right, they don't just hold massive amounts of extra inventory for fun.
Exactly. So when you lose 1 billion barrels, you're severely depleting strategic reserves globally. You're forcing massive refineries to just idle because they lack the raw feedstock.
Oh, so the refineries physically can't run.
Right, and you're disrupting the incredibly complex logistics of getting crude from the wellhead to the end consumer. You don't just magically replace that lost inventory overnight. The logistical backlog alone takes months to clear.
And the human element of trying to navigate this backlog is just wild. I was looking at the maritime tracking data from Krapler, the analytics firm.
Oh, yeah. What did they see?
Well, they reported that last week, at least 2 oil tankers successfully made it out of the strait. But the only way they managed it was by completely turning off their location tracking systems.
Wait, really?
Yeah, they went entirely dark to avoid Iranian detection and potential attack. It's like the world's most vital economic highway has suddenly been subjected to a toll enforced by snipers in the hills.
That is such a dangerous game to play.
I know. If you want to get your cargo through, you have to turn off your headlights, kill the engine noise, and sneak through in the dead of night. So my question is, how long can the global economy actually sustain a ghost ship supply chain where multi-million-dollar tankers have to play hide and seek?
The short answer is it really can't.
Mm-hmm.
And this brings us to a fascinating mechanism that quietly dictates all of global trade, which is maritime insurance.
Insurance, of course.
Yeah, modern shipping isn't just governed by navies, It's governed by actuaries at places like Lloyd's of London. An oil tanker carries cargo worth tens or hundreds of millions of dollars.
So when ships start turning off their transponders, which, by the way, is a massive safety and regulatory violation in normal time.
Yeah, a huge violation.
Yeah.
And when they do that, war risk insurance premiums just skyrocket.
Because they literally can't track the asset they are insuring.
Exactly. If you can't track it, you can't assess the risk. And eventually, major insurers simply declare that they will not underwrite a vessel entering those specific waters.
Making it uninsurable.
Right. And once a vessel is uninsurable, that multi-million-dollar ship and its cargo become a toxic asset. Shipping companies simply won't risk moving uninsurable ships. So this ghost ship tactic, it isn't a clever, sustainable workaround. It's an act of sheer desperation.
It's basically a blazing red warning light that the supply chain is actively breaking down.
Absolutely.
And because that economic panic is setting in, the crisis is now bleeding over borders. Other nations are basically being forced to intervene to protect their own economic lifelines.
We're watching a localized U.S.-Iran standoff transform into this sprawling, multinational militarized zone.
Right. And this is happening despite the massive U.S. military footprint already in the region.
The U.S. military presence in the Gulf is historically expansive. I mean, we're talking about major entrenched bases in Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Oman.
And the foundational doctrine for decades has been that this overwhelming force acts as an ironclad deterrent against regional instability, right?
That was the idea, yeah. But that deterrence is clearly fracturing now.
Big time. I mean, over the weekend, we saw specific reports of drone interceptions. Kuwait actually had to intercept drones in their airspace. The UAE reported their air defense systems shot down 2 drones originating from Iran.
And then, you have that whole incident off the coast of Qatar.
Oh, right, the cargo ship.
Yeah. The UK Maritime Trade Operations, or UKMTO, which kind of acts as an information clearinghouse for shipping security, they reported an attack 23 nautical miles northeast of Doha.
And they said a large cargo ship was hit by an unknown object, causing a minor fire. Right?
Yes. But what makes this incredibly volatile is the conflicting narratives surrounding the event. The UKMTO was very cautious in its assessment.
But the Iranian media wasn't.
Not at all. Fars News, which is a major Iranian outlet, immediately claimed the vessel was a U.S.-flagged ship owned by the United States.
So we have a literal information war layered on top of an economic blockade. And the international community is scrambling to figure out how to respond.
They really are.
Like today, Monday, May 11th, defense ministers from over 40 countries are meeting to discuss a UK-led plan to protect shipping. The meeting is being co-chaired by the UK's John Healey and France's Catherine Vautrin. But even among these close allies, there is serious diplomatic friction regarding how to actually handle this.
There's a massive divide on the core strategy here. The UK is committing to sending warships to protect the sea lanes.
Which sounds like a standard military response.
It does, but Prime Minister Keir Starmer made it very clear that the UK mission only happens after the fighting ends.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it's envisioned entirely as a post-conflict stabilization plan. France, on the other hand, is taking a drastically different approach. President Emmanuel Macron explicitly clarified that France is not sending naval forces. Instead, he stated they are coordinating with Iran on security.
Wait, coordinating with Iran, that is a massive split between London and Paris, coordinating with Iran versus sending warships to deter them.
It's a huge split. But France's calculation is directly reactive to the threat landscape. Over the weekend, an Iranian military spokesperson threatened a decisive and immediate response against any French or British troops deploying to the strait.
So Paris clearly calculated that sending warships would just paint a target on their back.
Exactly. They saw it as escalating the situation while the UK is trying to project Allied strength, albeit with that huge caveat of waiting for a ceasefire to actually deploy.
Yeah, let me challenge the entire premise of this military strategy, though, because we just listed half a dozen countries where the U.S. has major bases. We're talking about billions of dollars in military hardware just sitting in the Gulf.
Right.
Yet commercial ships are still getting hit, and drones are still penetrating Kuwaiti and Emirati airspace. So is the massive U.S. military presence actually deterring this conflict, or is it just expanding the target area? Like, if you are Iran, does having U.S. bases everywhere make you back down, or does it just give you more options of things to shoot at?
That is the million-dollar question. Historically, those bases were the ultimate safety net. The traditional U.S. model relies on overwhelming conventional superiority, right? Massive aircraft carriers, advanced fighter jets, sprawling installations.
Basically just looking so scary nobody wants to fight you.
Exactly. It's designed specifically to deter a state-on-state conventional war. But the calculus is entirely inverted here. We're seeing the realities of modern asymmetric warfare.
Meaning cheap weapons taking on incredibly expensive defenses.
Precisely. Drones are incredibly cheap to manufacture, they're highly mobile, and notoriously difficult for traditional radar to track. Iran and its proxies are using these low-cost tactics to completely bypass conventional U.S. strength.
Making the bases almost a liability.
To your point, yes, the presence of those bases absolutely expands the target matrix. When tensions hit a boiling point, those bases transition from deterrence to vulnerabilities.
That makes total sense.
Yeah, we're seeing situations where allied military forces have to spend massive resources. I mean, firing million-dollar interceptor missiles, just playing defense against a $2,000 drone. The traditional rules of deterrence simply don't apply to this kind of asymmetric threat.
And because that conventional military deterrence is struggling, and Western diplomacy has entirely stalled, the key players are resorting to highly unconventional strategies.
Very unconventional.
It's like watching a player in a complex board game realize the current rules are stacked against them, so they just decide to buy out their own contract and play a completely different game.
I love that analogy.
Let's look at the market's new hope, which surprisingly rests on China right now.
This is a profound geopolitical pivot. This week, Donald Trump is heading to China for a high-stakes meeting with President Xi Jinping.
Which is huge news on its own.
It is. And according to Tony Sycamore, a market analyst from IG, the global energy markets are laser-focused on this visit. The prevailing hope is that the U.S. will actually ask Beijing to step in and use its significant leverage over Tehran to force a comprehensive ceasefire and unblock the strait.
It's just an incredible image. The U.S. president flying to Beijing to ask the Chinese president to solve a Middle Eastern crisis.
It really highlights the shifting power dynamics.
Absolutely. And simultaneously, we have a shocking financial declaration from Israel. Prime Minister Netanyahu stated on national television that he wants to reduce the $3.8 billion in annual U.S. military aid to zero.
Yes. Zero.
He wants to start immediately and phase it out entirely over the next 10 years.
Looking at both of these moves objectively, based purely on the strategic implications, they represent a massive realignment of how global leverage is applied.
See, I'm genuinely trying to make sense of this, because why would a nation currently involved in a multi-front conflict voluntarily refuse $3.8 billion a year in military aid?
It seems counterintuitive.
Highly counterintuitive. And at the exact same time, why would a U.S. administration, which usually prides itself on projecting American power, need to rely on China to fix a blockade in the Persian Gulf? What are the actual underlying mechanics here?
Well, let's break down the mechanics, starting with Israel. In international relations, military aid is rarely just a blank check, it's a leash.
Ah, okay.
When the U.S. provides $3.8 billion a year, it comes with heavy strings attached. It usually includes requirements to purchase American weapons, strict adherence to American diplomatic timelines, and significant influence over strategic military decisions.
So by publicly stating a desire to phase that aid out to zero, Netanyahu is essentially trying to, buy out his own contract.
Yes, exactly. He is signaling a desire for absolute operational sovereignty. It's a calculated message that Israel will not be constrained by Washington's diplomatic pressure or the threat of withholding funds.
They want to write their own rules.
Right. By cutting the financial tether, they are making a long-term play for complete independence in writing their own rules of engagement without needing clearance from Washington.
Wow. And what about the U.S. relying on Beijing? How does that work?
That comes down to the mechanics of global oil consumption and sanctions. The U.S. has effectively exhausted its direct leverage over Iran.
Because we already sanctioned everything.
Exactly. Washington doesn't buy Iranian oil, and they've sanctioned Iran's economy to the absolute limit. There are very few economic levers left for the U.S. to pull.
But China still buys their oil, right?
Yes. China is the primary buyer of Iranian crude. They often acquire it through these complex shadow fleets and smaller independent refineries. They're often called teapot refineries to bypass Western sanctions.
So Beijing holds the purse strings to Tehran's economic survival.
That's it. The U.S. calculation here is incredibly pragmatic.
Yeah.
If American military threats and naval blockades aren't changing Iran's behavior, perhaps the threat of losing their biggest and perhaps only major customer will. It's a stark acknowledgement that in this specific economic choke point, Beijing's financial influence might actually be more powerful than American aircraft carriers.
We are watching the limits of traditional superpower diplomacy play out in real time. I mean, let's tie these massive threads together for a second.
Sure.
We started with a collapsed peace talk, a 14-condition memo from the U.S., and leaders basically just digging their heels in. And that diplomatic failure immediately translated into physical reality, the militarization of the world's most important energy corridor.
Which led directly to a billion-barrel oil deficit. And this wild environment where commercial ships have to turn off their transponders and risk becoming uninsurable toxic assets just to survive the journey.
Exactly. And that economic desperation at sea triggered a regional spillover, proving that conventional military deterrence, putting massive bases everywhere, is really struggling to contain asymmetric drone warfare.
Which ultimately leads to this bizarre new reality we're in now, where the U.S. is looking to China to act as the ultimate economic enforcer, while Israel attempts to cut its financial reliance on Washington to secure total operational freedom.
It is a complete reshuffling of the global deck. And I want to remind you, listening right now, why this actually matters to you.
Because it's not just abstract theory.
Right. This isn't just a distant geopolitical chess match between politicians in suits. That billion-barrel deficit we talked about, that dictates the price you pay at the pump tomorrow.
Oh, absolutely.
That 3% jump in crude oil directly impacts the cost to transport the groceries to your local supermarket. The fact that a vital trade artery is being treated like a combat zone threatens the foundational stability of the global economy that you rely on every single day to just keep your life moving smoothly.
The shockwaves from the Strait of Hormuz almost always end up on your receipt.
Yeah.
That's just the reality.
Which leaves us with one incredibly provocative thought to mull over as we wrap up. We talked at the beginning about how an invisible flow is ignored until a tourniquet is applied.
Right, the circulatory system analogy.
Exactly. Right now, the entire global energy market is being held hostage in a single narrow strait, resulting in ghost ships and massive deficits. If this crisis stretches on, will it ultimately force the rest of the world to aggressively and permanently decouple from Middle Eastern oil?
That's a fascinating question.
Could the sheer economic pain of these 10 weeks accelerate alternative energy and localized supply chains to such an extreme that decades from now, the Strait of Hormuz becomes geopolitically irrelevant?
It's definitely possible.
Think about what happens when the world simply decides it doesn't need that artery anymore. Something to think about. Until next time.